Hello and Happy New Year to all of you for joining us in today's webinar session. This is the first webinar we are having this year, 2023. And I'm Daniel Kostner, a principal consultant at LIST, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm super excited about this session. One, because of the topic, and two, because we have a very experienced consultant to deliver on this topic to us. So this, the topic on OKRs is a very exciting one and a fast-growing field. You realize that because of the benefits OKRs is bringing to organizations and the story of Google, there are a lot of tools coming up, a lot of concepts around OKRs, and it's creating, there's some misunderstanding on its application and in different scenarios. So in today's session, Andrew is going to help demystify the concept of OKRs and how we can apply it in SAFe. So to our speaker for today, our speaker is Andrew Sales. He's a product manager at Skilled Agile Inc., product manager for the SAFe framework. And he has great experience in leading organizations and helping drive agile ways of working. I would not want to take the wind out of his sail. I know Andrew has a lot to share with us today. So I will hand over to Andrew, and then he would take us through the slides. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Perfect. So, welcome everyone. It's great to be here today. And as Daniel mentioned, this is a really exciting topic. A lot of organizations are talking about how to use OKRs, objectives and key results, to really create alignment and help them execute their strategy successfully. So I'm going to spend about 20-25 minutes going through the topic specifically on how to apply OKRs in SAFe. And then as Daniel mentioned, we'll get into a Q&A and we'll get a vibrant discussion going about how you can implement these in your enterprise. Just a very quick introduction. As Daniel mentioned, I'm the product manager for the framework here at Scaled Agile. I'm part of the framework team. So constantly we're looking for ways that we can evolve the framework to support our customers and to support our partners. And one of the ways we did that recently was to incorporate OKRs into Scaled Agile. And that's, of course, the topic that I'm going to discuss today. Before we get into the detail, though, let's just take a step back and understand what the goal of SAFe is. So SAFe sets out as the goal of business agility. And as business agility, we talk about the ability to really compete and thrive in the digital age by quickly responding to market changes and emerging opportunities with the innovative business solutions that we're delivering. What we're noticing, though, is that in order to achieve business agility, it's going to require constant reflection. The environments within which enterprises are working are constantly changing. The pressures on them to compete are getting more and more challenging. So what we need is the ability to generate information. We need metrics to be able to measure the progress we're making. And then, of course, we need to decide the next best steps on this goal towards business agility. So in order to do that, we need a measurement model. And that's what I want to introduce here before we get into the specific topic of OKRs. Now, you might have seen this model previously. This is the model that we use in order to measure the progress that enterprises are making towards that goal of business agility. We introduced it into SAFe about a year ago now, and central to this model is 3 measurement domains. We want to measure competency. So are the ways of working, our lean agile practices, improving? Are we developing the skills of the individuals who do the work? We want to measure flow. Are we improving our ability to deliver value to our customers? And are we doing that more efficiently? And then importantly, we want to measure outcomes. Are we actually meeting the needs of our stakeholders and the business? And it's that outcome portion that OKRs fit into. They really help us understand whether we're attaining our strategic goals and whether we need to make any changes based on the results that we're seeing. But this is an important model because it's actually the combination of all 3 that gives us the holistic picture of where we are on this journey towards business agility. And it's also worth mentioning before we get into the detail of measuring outcomes, that this model, measuring outcomes, flow, and competency, can be applied at each level of the organization. So we can easily talk about an agile team measuring their outcomes through iteration goals. We can measure the agile release train in terms of its outcomes as PI objectives. And of course, we can measure the outcomes in terms of things like OKRs and strategic themes across the SAFe portfolio. So as I go through the slides today, just keep in mind that we're talking about one of the measurement domains that fits into a broader measurement model. And really, you need to have all three in place to really understand how your enterprise is operating and how efficiently you're delivering value to your customers. So let's get into the topic for today then, which is now talking about measuring outcomes. And although Daniel mentioned that we're going to focus on OKRs, objectives and key results, I want to say something very briefly about key performance indicators so we can compare and contrast those two approaches to how we're going to measure outcomes. Now, as you see on the slide here, outcomes, being one of the three measurement domains, can be measured in multiple different ways. We're, of course, going to talk about how we measure business performance through KPIs. We're going to talk about how we measure our progress in terms of executing our strategy as OKRs. But please keep in mind that there's other measures of outcomes, things like PI objectives, iteration goals, and also internal measures of outcomes, things like employee engagement. As we do the work and execute against our strategy, are we improving the environment that our employees work in? Are we creating an environment that's very conducive to high levels of productivity? But of course, today we're going to focus on these two outcome metrics, KPIs and OKRs. And what I find really useful as we start to get into the detail is contrasting KPIs and OKRs. So whereas OKRs, or objectives and key results, are the objectives that help us understand how we're working towards future success, the KPIs, the key performance indicators, they really measure the ongoing health of the organization. So if you look at the slide here, we tend to talk about KPIs, and I'll give you some examples shortly, measuring things like revenue. We're always going to measure revenue. That's a static performance indicator of how well we're executing the business. OKRs, on the other hand, and we're going to see some examples of them very shortly, are really there to communicate our strategic purpose. How are we trying to change the business to attain some kind of future state? And because of that, what we tend to find is that our KPIs, the key performance indicators, are more static and long-lived. We're always going to measure things like customer retention. We're always going to measure things like revenue. The OKRs, on the other hand, need to be reviewed and adjusted on a cadence. Whether it's every 6 months or once a year, we're continually asking ourselves, do these OKRs represent the strategy that we're trying to execute? Or based on the data that we're getting back, do we need to make some changes to that strategy to meet the needs of our customers or to adjust to some of the forces in the market? What I hope you see from this slide is that we need both. We need to have these ongoing health metrics, the KPIs, to measure business performance, but we also need the OKRs to help us strive towards a future state. And it's really the combination of these two that creates a very powerful picture, helping us to measure outcomes. Let's just say a few more things, though, about KPIs before we get to the OKRs. And in fact, one slide that's worth just talking about is the one that you see here. This will really inform our understanding of what it means to measure outcomes within SAFe. So if you think about SAFe is based around value streams. It's getting us to think about how do we move from a project-based approach to a product-centric view, where we organize around value and we continuously deliver that value to our customers. But in SAFe, there's two types of value stream. There's the operational value stream that describes the steps an organization takes to actually deliver that value to their customers, whether it's a service they're providing or some kind of product they're fulfilling. And then, of course, there's the development value stream, which includes the agile teams, the agile release train. Those are all the people building the systems and solutions that those operational value streams use, either to do their work or as the product they're actually selling to their customer. The reason we want to make this clear distinction is that although most of us work in the development value streams, when we come to measure the outcomes that the solutions we're building must deliver, we're really asking ourselves, are we improving the operations of the organization? Are we improving operational efficiency? Are we delivering better outcomes for the customers that those operational value streams are serving? And once we realize that connection, then it becomes much easier to think about things like KPIs and think about the outcomes that we're striving to achieve. Because what we realize very quickly is, depending on the operational work that the enterprise does, whether we're selling software products, whether we're fulfilling digital services, whether we're building and manufacturing cyber-physical devices, the type of work that we do will determine the type of outcomes that we need to achieve. So for example, if we're providing a customer loan, we're going to measure outcomes on things like customer lifetime value, things like net promoter score, things like how long does it take a customer to actually make a decision to procure our services. So anytime we're talking about measuring outcomes, whether it's through KPIs or through OKRs, we're always asking ourselves, how can we improve the operations of the organization and deliver better value to the ultimate customer, rather than just focusing on what we're doing in the development value streams. Let's now get into the detail of OKRs. So when we're teaching SAFe, or when we're working with organizations, and I'm sure Daniel has the same experience here, for many years we've been asked, when are you going to bring objectives and key results into SAFe? So many organizations have experienced firsthand, or perhaps they've read about some of the benefits that OKRs can bring in terms of creating transparency across the organization, creating alignment to the strategy we're trying to execute, and helping us then steer and deliver on that strategy. And the big challenge that we face is we didn't want to create overhead. We didn't want to create a dual system in SAFe where on the one hand we have iteration goals and PI objectives, and on the other hand we have a set of OKRs. And we didn't want to create a situation that was very confusing for our customers when thinking about how to implement them successfully. So what we did instead was to go away and ask ourselves, and to research, what are the specific use cases in SAFe where OKRs can add real value? And we came up with 3 use cases. The first one is to enhance that strategic alignment across a SAFe portfolio. We'll have a look at that in detail very shortly. The second one is to help us define the outcomes within our business cases. And the third, and a very important one, is to help us define the goals for the SAFe transformation itself. Now, before we get into the detail, I'll just mention that all of these use cases are optional. So although we see real benefit, it's for you to really decide where you might want to apply them. And then finally, the link at the bottom of the slide here contains further and deeper guidance of some of the topics that Daniel and I are going to talk about today. So let's have a look at these use cases. But before we do that, let's just make sure we're all happy about what we mean by a well-written OKR. And one of the things that you'll see in the article is guidance on how to form OKRs successfully. What we really want to do here is create OKRs that are focused around outcomes rather than outputs. We want to describe what is the future state that we're trying to achieve. And then, of course, the work to achieve that will be defined through our features and epics. When we define the objectives, we tend to talk about them being inspirational. So we want to create objectives that really inspire our employees to action. We want them to be clear and memorable. One of the real challenges we see with OKRs is people create very lengthy OKRs that are very difficult to remember, to remind ourselves in terms of what we're trying to achieve. It becomes a real burden in terms of using them day to day. And then we tend to talk about OKRs being either committed or aspirational. So by committed, we mean that perhaps 70% of OKRs we expect to achieve. Aspirational are things that are really going to stretch us. We may not achieve them all the time, but they're really pushing us out of our comfort zone. They're trying to stretch the organization to achieve ambitious targets. And then finally, we tend to be able to organize our OKRs into 2 categories, either those about the work that we're doing, the products and solutions we're delivering, or about how we're going to improve work. And when we look at the transformational OKRs, that's where they come into play. We're going to think about how we can shorten lead times, accelerate value delivery to our customers. We're going to create OKRs around things like improving quality. And then finally, every objective has to be coupled with some key results, typically 2 to 5 key results, and all of them talk about the value that's being delivered. They're also measurable. And what that means is they have some kind of implicit scale, maybe a percentage, maybe asking us to increase from X to Y, that allows us to say whether we're actually attaining that key result. And then finally, and really importantly, we talk about them being gradable. And what that means is that when you measure them, you want to try and avoid key results that have a simple yes or no. Did we achieve this? Yes or no. Instead, we want to be able to measure them continually throughout the year. And that's why things like percentages, attainment targets, whatever it might be, allow us to see the progress that we're making. Here's a good example of an objective and key result. And what this slide really illustrates is the benefit and the power that comes with having multiple key results attached to a single objective. What we tend to find when we have an objective that's supported only by a single key result is that you may be increasing in the positive direction that individual result, but you have no illustration of whether you're affecting negatively other results that are attached with it. So here we have an objective to achieve a dominant position within the autonomous delivery market. That's pretty clear. We can see that we're moving most of these key results in the right direction. Our net promoter score is going up. We're improving our repeat business. But actually in Q3, we saw 2 key results going down. The serviceable market wasn't improving like we expected, and we weren't acquiring new customers. So immediately this tells us that we might be focusing too much on our existing customer base and the key results attached to that, whereas actually we need to move our attention towards the new customers, and you can see that an adjustment was made in Q4. So it's this balance of key results that gives us the holistic systems view. This is really critical to make sure we're achieving our objectives successfully. The second thing to say, of course, before we get into the use cases, is that this can only be successful if you have the ability to measure continuously. So one of the things we talk to enterprises about is as you define your objectives and the key results, you need to ask yourself a critical question. Do we have the ability to gather the data necessary to measure these key results on the required cadence? Typically, we're measuring quarterly in our strategic portfolio review. And if we don't have the ability to measure quarterly, then we need to start thinking about how do we build this technology into the systems that we're delivering. Otherwise, we're going to find it very difficult to track the progress that we're making. So let's have a look at these 3 use cases that have proved to be extremely useful within safe enterprises. And the first one here is enhancing alignment across a safe portfolio. Now at the top, we have our portfolio strategic themes. And for all you who are working with SAFE today, you'll know that we've always spoken about using OKRs to define strategic themes. These are the broad themes that describe the strategy that the portfolio is trying to execute, and they really connect us to the broader enterprise strategy within our organizations. What we've found, though, over time is that sometimes these portfolios contain thousands of people, tens of thousands of people working together on a particular solution. And because of that, we often find that these higher level strategic themes can feel very distant or disconnected from the work that's happening day to day within the value streams or the agile release trains within that portfolio. So we've started to see huge benefit in allowing those value streams and agile release trains to create objectives that align to the strategic themes. And you can see the example on the slide here. And this does 2 things. Number one, it's creating localized objectives that speak more directly to the work that needs to happen within those value streams and agile release trains. But secondly, it allows us then to measure more regularly the progress that they're making. Because what we find is that as we start to align objectives at each level, it shortens the time horizons over which we're able to measure them. So by creating an approach like this, we can ensure that everyone is aligned to the overall strategy that we're trying to execute, that they have real clarity on the work that they need to do, and they have the ability to measure over shorter time horizons, help them adjust the work more effectively. Now, I'm sure one thing that we might talk about after the slides is that within OKRs, we don't cascade them in the way that we might when we spoke previously about things like management by objectives. So we're not handing down the strategic themes to the value stream and asking them to decompose that. Instead, we're permitting people within the arts and the value streams to create objectives that align to the strategy. And by allowing them to do that creation, it ensures that they create objectives that talk more closely to what they need to do. So this is really the first and perhaps most common use case, creating these OKRs to ensure that at each level of the organization, we have good alignment to the strategic themes. Now, the second use case is really helping us to define better business outcomes for our epics and the lean business cases that we're creating. And here we see OKRs turning up in 3 manners. So the first is the one you see on the slide here. Once we have this OKR, it becomes a brilliant way of testing whether our epics those big initiatives, the significant pieces of development that we're doing really support the strategy. So we're asking the organization to use the OKRs as a test as they start validating or invalidating new ideas for epics. Now, it's worth saying something very briefly here about the relationship between epics and OKRs. One of the other challenges that we see with OKRs is that organizations create them separated from ideas around the epics they may deliver. And the challenge with that is if you separate them and you don't consider the epics that might help to realize these OKRs, is you might create OKRs that are simply not viable or feasible for you as an organization to deliver. We could create an OKR now for anything that we wanted to. Whether we had the ability to deliver it is another matter. So by making sure that you always have in mind some of the epics that you may deliver to execute on that OKR, it ensures the feasibility of the strategy that you're putting in place. So very simply, we use the OKRs to validate or invalidate our ideas. And then as we take one of those epics and create an epic hypothesis statement, and I'm sure many of you on the call will recognize this template, a simple template for describing the value proposition of this new epic alongside the expected business outcomes, using the OKR format to describe those business outcomes is again a great way to make them outcome focused. So we're seeing a lot of organizations now use it as part of their epic hypothesis statement. Perhaps 2 to 3 business outcomes described as objectives. You can see some examples on the slide here, and each one supported by the key results. It really forces you not only to take an outcome-centric approach, but to think very deeply about how you're going to measure these business outcomes as you start to deliver the value to your customers. And then finally, inside the same use case, we see them coming into force again when you define your MVPs. So just think about the flow that we've looked at very carefully. We're using the OKRs to validate or invalidate epic ideas. We're then using them within the epic hypothesis statement to define very clearly the business outcomes. And now, as we start to deliver that epic, we always start by delivering an MVP first, a minimal viable product, to either invalidate or validate that we're on the right track in terms of something that our customers really want. Well, we can actually use the OKR format to define the objectives of this MVP. What are we expecting to validate? What are we expecting to test? And then what are the key results that will show us whether the hypothesis was proven or disproven? So again, the format of thinking very deeply about objectives coupled with the key results is a great way of making sure that your business cases and your epics are very outcome focused. Let's have a look at the third and final use case before I say a few things and hand it back to Daniel. This is one where we've seen great application of OKRs. Many organizations are going through a safe transformation or even a transformation of any kind. Some of those organizations really struggle to quantify the benefits that they've delivered. Perhaps they feel anecdotally that they've improved the ways of working, but they don't necessarily have the ability to demonstrate what those improvements are. And one of the reasons for that is they didn't set out at the beginning any clear goals or put in place any idea of how they're going to measure those. So we're seeing the OKR format used very effectively to solve those problems. You can see on the slide here, we have some overall transformation outcomes. We've got alignment that the safe transformation is going to help us improve time to market, increase quality, and increase employee engagement and job satisfaction. That's an important first step because there's plenty of reasons you can be implementing SAFE to achieve. We've now got clarity on what they are. But more than that, using the same approach as before, we can allow other areas of the business, other portfolios or value streams to define their more localized OKRs to describe their objectives that they're trying to deliver with their transformation. So this autonomous delivery portfolio also wants to improve customer satisfaction ratings, but specifically for them, they want to reduce mean time to resolution. The other thing this gives us, of course, is the ability to define very clearly how we're going to validate whether we're achieving this. So at the beginning, I mentioned that we talk about OKRs falling into 2 categories, either doing work, we saw those previously, now we're talking about improving work. And if we have as an organization the objective to improve time to market, we need to ask ourselves what that looks like in our context. Well, maybe it looks like reducing approval rates for new initiatives. Maybe it looks like retiring some of our non-supported solutions. Maybe it looks like being able to deliver value to our customers more quickly. But again, unless we set out at the beginning how we're going to measure the improvements of the transformation, it becomes very difficult to validate the work that we're making. So the key message here is by setting out your transformation goals early and often, it creates alignment across the organization, it creates the urgency for change, but importantly, it will give you the ability to really measure the progress that you're making. Now, just a couple more slides before I hand it back to Daniel. And one of the ones I want to talk about is this one. Within SAFE, one of the key artifacts we use are PI objectives. They describe the commitment that we're making when we come out of PI planning. And they're written in clear, business-facing language, typically using the SMART format. One of the questions we often get is, should we use OKRs in place of our PI objectives? And our answer here tends to be no. We're not suggesting you replace your PI objectives with OKRs for a couple of reasons. First of all, don't forget PI objectives are an output. They're an output of the planning process in terms of the work we're committing to. The OKRs tend to be an input. They're helping us understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. Secondly, PI objectives are written in the way they are because we're time constrained. During PI planning, we have a few breakouts, short time to really describe what it is that we're going to work on. OKRs, as Daniel will attest to, really take time to craft very well. So we tend to find that the time boxes don't commit it. But thirdly, we also find with OKRs that they tend to be more lagging in nature in terms of how we measure them. PI objectives need to be immediately measurable to help us steer the arc throughout the PI. So we tend to find there's a bit of a difference between what we're trying to achieve with the objective, the PI objectives, and the OKRs, and we tend to not confuse or conflate the two. Now, just one final thing to say for myself is, as we start to roll out OKRs and measurement more broadly, we need to be mindful of a few things. And we've actually collected together on this slide some of the success factors that our enterprises and customers have seen and some of the pitfalls to be aware of. So, of course, make sure we're using measurement in conjunction with other discovery tools. And what that means is that when we see the key results attached to the OKRs moving in perhaps a negative direction, we don't want to jump to conclusions, but instead we want to go and understand what's happening. We go out to where the work is taking place. We speak to our customers. We speak to our employees. We make sure we interpret the numbers correctly. We also only want to apply metrics where they support improved decision-making. So when I mentioned that OKRs were optional, make sure you're using them in situations where they really deliver value. Ask yourself whether using OKRs here would be beneficial. If they would, use them. If not, don't burden yourself with overuse or trying to measure too much. Be careful of the effect of measures and metrics on behavior, of course. If your OKRs are linked to things like individual compensation, you may find that you generate some undesirable behaviors in terms of the ways people are working. You may even find that some of the data you get back doesn't represent a true picture because, of course, we've now introduced, we've now caused people to be affected by the key results that we're trying to drive in terms of their own personal achievement. And then finally, as I mentioned, make sure we're interpreting the metrics very carefully. One of the great things about objectives and key results is because we have multiple key results, we have the ability to really make sure, are we increasing across the board versus are we improving in one area at the detriment of something else? So lots to think about. This was just meant to be a very quick summary of where we see OKRs in SAFE. I'll pass it back now to Daniel and looking forward to the discussion as we dig into some of these topics more deeply. So back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Andrew, for such an insightful presentation and bringing OKRs in the context of SAFE to light.